Hello, everybody. I'm Dwight A. Moody in the Meeting House, and this is the second part of my conversation with the Reverend Dr. Tory Baucum. He now is the director of the Benedictine Center for Family Life at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. But it's been a long journey, a ministerial and personal journey, beginning with in Kansas City with his Quaker roots, ending up with his reception into the Roman Catholic Church just a couple of years ago. He talks to us about this whole journey in part two of my interview with him. Tory, you've talked to us about how you got pulled to Poland. This has been the latest chapter in your long and interesting journey through life. But I want to start at the other end about the earliest part of your Christian formation. Tell us about this. In what kind of context did you grow up into Christ?
Well, like a lot of children whose parents divorced, my grandparents had an outsized influence on me. My paternal grandfather was several generations Quaker, a Quaker farmer in Kansas. And I spent a lot of my summers with him on the farm. He was a Wendellberry kind of person. Very much a sage, very much a kind, very much a peaceable man.
Wow, what a great gift.
That was a big influence that I mean, I knew it was special at the time, but as I got older, it became all the more important to me. It shaped me on race issues. I've always been, even though I've been in more conservative Christian circles most of my life, on racial issues, I've never been a conservative in that sense. And that's really because of his influence, I think. He shaped how I saw that issue. On my paternal side was my grandmother. I tell her, she had 10 children. She wasn't Catholic. She was old school Baptist. And so she was a salty, old, godly Baptist woman who just, I think, prayed me into the kingdom as much as anything. I had 8 aunts. One of them became Catholic. She was ostracized for a bit, but then reconciled. But she was my favorite aunt, and I spent a summer with her in Tucson, Arizona once when I was in junior high school. And I remember she said to me, "Tory, the Baptists taught me Jesus, but the Catholics made him beautiful to me."
Oh, what a nice statement.
Yeah, and that always stayed with me. I always thought there was something to that. And so Dwight, I went, my parents separated. I lived in Kansas until I was in junior high school. I moved to Texas to live with my father. I was mostly unchurched while I was in Kansas. But my dad took us to a Baptist church. I went to an interdenominational youth group in Texas. And like I tell everybody who's not from Texas, that everybody's Baptist in Texas, even the Catholics.
Even the Catholics are Baptist.
So this was an interdenominational youth group, but it had a real Baptist flavor to it. And this was like, if you've seen the movie, The Jesus Revolution, this was on the tail end of the Jesus movement. So people like Keith Green had moved out from California to a place called Lindale, Texas, and this British holiness preacher, Leonard Ravenhill, was the teacher. And young people, young adults from all over East Texas would gather there. And I was one of those. My girlfriend at the time was at a college in East Texas, and I was at Criswell College, and we would meet in Lindale. And this Catholic girl ended up becoming a Wycliffe Bible translator, and I ended up becoming an Episcopal priest. But those were very charged, powerful moments that I think were genuine. And that was the deep. And so those are the spiritual undercurrents that were feeding me, even though I was at a conservative Baptist college, even call it a fundamentalist Baptist college. So
and not just any college, Tory. I mean, Criswell, the name, and the college and the church is kind of
Yeah.
public epicenter of what we now call Baptist fundamentalism in a way.
But see, I was not aware of all that history because I didn't have that background. I went there because, just a series of events. I got introduced to Paige Patterson, and they basically paid for my education, and neither one of my parents were college grads, and I had this heart. I thought I was going to be a missionary at the time. I was good with biblical languages, and I even did a summer Institute of Linguistics with Wycliffe Bible translators, thinking I would do that. Like I said, my girlfriend ended up doing it. I went a different route. And it was during those years that I was also reading some Anglican writers like C.S. Lewis and Chesterton. And my mom, when she ever went to the church, she went to the Episcopal Church. And I think it's because it was more liberal and gracious to someone in her situation. And I took note of that. So I eventually started attending an Episcopal church, even though I was still going to Baptist schools, Baptist colleges. And so somebody asked me, did I ever consider becoming a Baptist pastor? And I said, no, that would have been a disaster. I knew I could never do that. So what I kept thinking was, well, maybe I'll do mission work of some sort. And of course, I didn't know the church very well. And so, I started attending the Episcopal Church. I had an encounter with Christ at the Eucharist, which I did not understand, I went to this church, and the first thing when I walked in, I said, this was Catholic. And that was not a good thing at the time. And but I sensed God telling me, go forward, go do what the guy in front of you is doing. And that's exactly what I did. And I had this encounter with Christ. So I'm in this Baptist seminary, and my first paper was the Anglican view of the Lord's Supper. Even the language, I didn't call it the Eucharist, I didn't call it Mass, I just said Lord's Supper. And, I got a prayer book, and I got 39 articles, and I did a research paper, mainly because I was trying to figure out what happened, because I had this the same experience with the Holy Spirit at these Keith Green, Leonard Ravenhill Bible studies, I had at this high church Episcopal altar. And so I was trying to make sense of it. So anyway, that was kind of the beginning. And of course, in a year later, I'm up in Pittsburgh because a friend of mine at the Baptist seminary said, you need to check out this seminary. And I wasn't yet ready to convert because I knew it was going to be hard in my relationship with my father, mostly. And also, I just didn't know if I really believed it. And so I had this opportunity to help do some missionary work for the Home Mission Board Society in Pittsburgh and take classes as a non-declared student at this Episcopal seminary.
Now, what year was that? Get me straight.
That was in the mid-'80s, about 1985, 84, something like that. So I ended up doing 2 degrees there, a master's and an MDiv, and while I was there, I got confirmed into the Episcopal Church.
And that, of course, is where you and I first got connected. At the time, I was a pastor in Pittsburgh. I don't know how you contacted me or what, but somehow you and I got connected while you were in Pittsburgh. I was already familiar with the seminary out in Ambridge. I had been out there a number of times. And so that's where we got connected. But I guess I didn't know that all along your journey through Baptist land, you had these epiphanies of sorts, these flashes of inspiration from both the Catholic and the Episcopal traditions. And that kind of prepared you for what was coming.
Well, yeah, because of that, having those first spiritual encounters with the late stages of the Jesus movement, these people that I just mentioned to you. Of course, I didn't know what any of this was. I didn't know the genesis of it. I later did a couple of theology degrees, mostly to understand what in the world I had encountered.
Right.
Much as anything, faith seeking understanding. But over time, what I really was drawn to was Pentecostalism and Catholicism. And I began to see that these were two forms of Christianity that both lived under an open heaven. And that made sense to me. That was real to me. And I go to the Black Pentecostal Church in Atchison whenever I can after Mass. And that's the community I work most closely with.
You may be aware of this, that Pittsburgh is where the Catholic Pentecostal movement in America started.
Catherine Coleman.
Students from Duquesne University. And when I was doing graduate work at Notre Dame, reading Thomas Aquinas, my teacher was, you may remember this story, the papal liaison with the Catholic charismatic movement in the United States. And he led the charismatic mass every week. Ed O'Connor was his name, wrote a book on Pope Paul VI and the Spirit. That's a very interesting mix-up, Pentecostalism and Catholicism. So you left Pittsburgh with your degrees and confirmed in the Episcopal Church and went where?
We went to Little Rock, Arkansas, and this was the late 80s. And Bill Clinton was the governor there, and I ended up buying a house just 2 blocks away from the governor's mansion. And my boss, the dean of the Episcopal Cathedral, was a friend of Bill and Hillary's. They both were Rhodes Scholars at Oxford. And my boss met his wife at Oxford, who was the daughter of Lord Maud, the Lord of University College there at Oxford. So that I then got introduced into that whole world of Arkansas politics. I tell people that's where my real education began. And we don't need to go into that. But from there, I went to Kansas City, which is my boyhood home. I'd been away for over 20 years, and I met Elizabeth, who became my wife. She was practicing law here, and we had our first 2 daughters. And
how old were you when you married?
I was 33.
Okay.
So we were both in our 30s, and it was pretty much love at first sight. We, as I tell people, we met, were engaged and married all within 8 months, and then for the next 18 months, we were in marital therapy. So you got to do the work one way or the other.
I hear you.
Everybody who's listening to this hears me.
We all know.
Yeah. So from here, this is when I first started reading John Paul II. I had an opportunity to go to Asbury to work on my doctorate. There were a couple of people in particular, Howard Snyder, who was my doctoral mentor, a man by the name of Dale Galloway, who was kind of a practitioner in domestic church. He built a church out in Portland on small groups. He didn't always use the language that the Catholic Church uses, but he understood all of the lessons, that were essential to it. So that was a great experience. And Howard allowed me to write my dissertation on Augustine's catechumenate in Wesley's class meeting, which again, there's not a lot of places that would have allowed me to do something like that, but he thought I was onto something, this idea of domestic church throughout Christianity. And so those were wonderful years. And then I got to teach while I was there. I was invited. I became an associate professor. So I was there for a decade. And from there, I was called to Fairfax, Virginia to pastor a Truro church.
So you were a practicing Episcopal priest in Kansas City, but reading John Paul II.
Yeah.
And in spite of those 2 influences, you came to one of the more conservative evangelical seminaries in Kentucky. And it was there that you got, I think, pulled into the Anglican side of the Episcopal Church. Tell us about that. because Truro, of course, was Anglican in the American sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as you know, the Episcopal Church really started splitting during those years while I was at Asbury. So I was kind of on the sidelines, which I really was kind of glad to be. I mean, I was helping out. I was a supply priest at a local Episcopal church in Lexington.
Mm-hmm.
And, but I was also working for a church in London called Holy Trinity Brompton, and I was helping. Again, it was a domestic church kind of approach to evangelization, this course called the Alpha Course.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to travel around the world to help with that and travel around the United States. And being a professor gave me permission to do that because I didn't have weekend responsibilities. And so when I went to Truro, actually, Truro had left the Episcopal Church, but there was no new denomination. I remember my first sermon, which I think was probably prophetic. I said, listen, guys, I'm coming here to be your pastor. And whether you voted to stay or to leave, I still would have come. And now people heard that in one of two ways. One that was that I wasn't really committed to the political cause. And the other was, Tory has come here to be our pastor, not to continue the political fight. And that's really what I was trying to say, that I'm here to be your pastor, and, you spend enough time and energy on the fight. That's not really what I'm here to do.
I want to give a little more background to this tension that was going on in the Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm.
It's still going on.
Yep.
It dominates the news in the Episcopal world worldwide. Hardly a week goes by that there's not another development about it, where the Episcopal Church worldwide, centered with the Archbishop of Canterbury, is struggling over how to interpret the Bible, especially related to LGBTQ people. And of course, the Anglican movement in the United States, not to be confused with the way the word Anglican is used around the world, but the Anglican part of the Episcopal Church is that conservative wing that wants to, that is not ready to welcome and be hospitable to the LGBTQ community as far as ordination, marriage, those kinds of things are. That's what's going on. It was going on back in the 80s. And now here we are. The Methodist Church is going through the same thing right now, struggling with this very issue. And as you may well know, Asbury Seminary is right at the forefront of that movement, creating, as you know, the Global Methodist Church. But so you were in Truro, just outside of Washington, D.C., pastoring one of these formerly Episcopal but now Anglican churches. You were there how long?
I was there 13 years.
13 years.
Yeah, which is a good long tenure in the Episcopal world.
It is, and the Baptist world. That'd be a good long tenure.
I inherited this lawsuit with the Episcopal Diocese.
You need to explain what that is. What lawsuit are you talking about?
Well, it was a lawsuit around our separation and wanting to keep the property.
Right.
There were thousands of these kinds of lawsuits all over the country. Then I also inherited, or didn't know it at the time, were some sex scandals. So early on, I realized, I had a church that was in grave crisis, much more than what a lot of people in the pews realized. And I was dealing with some dishonest Anglican bishops, just to be blunt. And so I was looking for help. And two things I did. One was I reached out to the Episcopal bishop to see if we could settle the lawsuit in a more amicable way. And, instead of spending another $1 million. We'd already spent $1 million on a lawsuit, and I didn't want to spend another. The long and short of that story is that the bishop and I became friends. He's still a dear friend of mine, and we settled the lawsuit, and Truro was able to retain the property with an agreement only to take care of it and to maintain the piecework. and we were the only church in America that had that kind of result at that time. I think there's been some others since then. So, and that, in fact, that's it was so unusual. The New York Times did a story. Michael Polson of the New York Times, who was also part of Spotlight fame and the Boston Globe story about sex. He came down and interviewed me, and I knew it was a risk to be interviewed by the New York Times. But he was intrigued by this story. He said, I'm surprised that you guys are kind of treating each other like human beings. And he was the one who asked me, well, when you went down to Shannon, did you take him anything? And I said, yeah, I took him a book of poems. And he said, well, by who? And I said, Adam Zagierski. So that's what made it into the New York Times, which Adam read and then invited me to Poland. So all of these things are interconnected.
So after 13 years there, you left the church there in Falls Church, Virginia, and you entered the Roman Catholic Church. What was it about the Catholic Church that drew you in?
Well, it was not just one thing. It was 1,000 things that I'd been engaging with over many years. I've always had a deep love for all of Christianity, all of the church, and I felt like the Catholic Church worked harder than anybody I knew at Church Unity. They really work hard at it, and that's why it has such a big tent. All the different factions you see in the Protestant church, they're all in the Catholic Church, but they don't splinter. Like there's 50,000 Protestant splinter groups right now, probably 50,100 since we started this.
Right.
And and that's what was happening with Anglicanism. It was becoming a splinter group, and I just wasn't interested in being another part of another splinter group. So that was one issue, the unity issue. And John Paul II was huge. His teaching, his way of looking at the world, his way of embracing the world. When I made friends with all these left-wing intelligentsia at the Evangelical University, and a lot of them weren't going to Mass anymore. They were estranged from the church. But whenever I asked them, but they hadn't repudiated the faith. They were still Catholic. But whenever I asked them about John Paul II, their faces would light up. And I realized that they loved this man. I remember this one philosopher, he took me out to the park in Krakow where John Paul II had his first Mass after becoming Pope. After returning to Krakow the first time in 1979. And this was a kind of a secular philosopher, brilliant man, like everybody over there that at Jagiellonian, they speak like 7 or 8 languages.
Right.
They mastered several disciplines.
Right.
And he took me out to the field and he said, Tory, people started showing up 48 hours before the Mass.
Yeah.
He said, I got there midway at 24 hours. And he said, Tory, when Poles get together, they all drink. But he said, nobody was drunk. We were all in, just so much anticipation, expectation for this moment. And when he came and he preached and he celebrated, he said, it's like he lifted the whole country up. And he said, because of him, I believe in the Holy Spirit.
What a great testimony. So
you don't forget conversations like that.
That's right.
All of these things were working on me, working on my heart, and I just realized my dad was deeply anti-Catholic. And I had been for several years contemplating becoming Catholic, a number of the years while I was at Truro, and didn't know how to do it. My work was so consuming. I couldn't find time. But after he died, I just felt like I had permission to take that step. And because his antipathy towards Catholicism was, it was not good. And we already had enough heartburn in our relationship. So, but when he died, I went to my friend Father Paul Scalia, several months later, and I said, I think I want to become Catholic. I just have no idea how to do it. That was how it all.
And that was about 3 years ago. So what started?
No, That was 2018, that conversation.
Okay, so it started with Quaker influence, and then Baptist, and then Evangelical, and Episcopal, Anglican, and now Catholic. It's been quite a journey. Tory, thank you for talking with us about it. It's a fascinating journey. I hope it helps people who watch this interview. God bless you in your work. Thank you for talking to us. Thank you for visiting with us in the meeting house. I'm Dwight A. Moody. I'll be back in just a minute. Thank you for joining our two-part conversation with the Reverend Dr. Tory Baucum. He now is the director of the Benedictine Center for Family Life at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. But how he got there is a long and interesting story, and he tells us this story in this part 2 of my interview with him. I hope you'll watch both parts of this two-part interview. The first part about his connection to Poland and the impact that that's had on his spiritual life and journey, and this part 2 on kind of a long look at how he started in Kansas City and has ended up near there in Atchison, Kansas. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net for all of these interviews, podcasts, book reviews, and commentaries. I'm Dwight Moody, your host in the Meeting House, where we have conversation on religion and American life.